All right, now we're going to move on to our second area of discussion. Kristen, church has often been criticized in how they've handled homosexuality, including members within the church. Do you agree with this criticism, and how can the church handle homosexuality more effectively?
Yeah, well, I think it's a pretty blanket statement to say that the church has not handled homosexuality the best in the past. And, I am not part of the generation. I think a huge part of this happened like 20, 30 years ago. In that time, I do think it's gotten better, but most definitely the church has been very abusive of people in the past. You look online and you'll find horror stories of people who say they walked into the church and, they were told to leave because they were homosexual, or, stories like that break my heart and that I think are very wrong. I do not think that that's what Jesus would do. And that's not what Jesus did. Jesus came across people with messed up sexualities all the time. When he was on earth, he saw the woman who had been with multiple men, and that's the verse that a lot of people use, you who have not sinned, cast the first stone. But I think a lot of times the church looks at this like something that's new to God, something that if we talk about it, that it's almost a hot button topic. And it is. It's a big deal, and it's something that definitely needs to be discussed. But I think more than discussing, the church needs to act on it. I think the church is not a place where perfect people can come and sit and edify themselves. And I think that has wrongfully become something that has been prevalent in our culture. But I think the church's place is to bring people in who are struggling and who are in need of restoration and who are in need of grace. And that's our duty. That's our duty as Christians, is to reach out and accept the people who are hurting. But I think with acceptance, we must also preach truth. And I think that is kind of a fuzzy area where we want to be accepting, but we don't want to point out faults either. And so I think one thing the church needs to do is find that line between reaching out to people and bringing them in and being the church and showing love and showing redemption, and also still preaching truth and standing on what is biblical and stating what we do believe is true.
And Drew, would you agree with Kristen's assessment?
Absolutely. I feel like one of the biggest words that you use there is acceptance, and I feel like that's probably one of the most misinterpreted terms when it comes to how we view church and its members. It's not necessarily. I feel like the homosexual community comes into the church with the expectation that kind of just like take us as we are and don't correct us necessarily, because they don't. A lot of homosexuals don't necessarily think that it's a sin, and I think that's. I feel like, again, you also said that we need to act as well, and I think the first step is addressing ignorance in the church, and not necessarily like just talking about it or anything like that, but I feel like we need to understand more about the issue. And I feel like there's a lot of people that I've talked to personally that I wouldn't want them talking to any of the homosexual friends I have, trying to get them to come to their church. It wouldn't work out. And then I think that acting is definitely the second step to that. And then again, going back to acceptance, we don't accept the members of our churches currently in the sin that they're in. And this kind of goes back to points we were making earlier, like sin is sin no matter what, and we don't accept who we are in our sin. We accept who we are in Christ. And I feel like that idea needs to be conveyed more clearly. And it's not necessarily that every church doesn't, but I feel like that's probably one of the biggest points that gets missed, and that gets kind of lopped into the rejection that a lot of people see as well.
Drew, and one thing you mentioned, you said that there is ignorance in the church. Can you maybe expand on that and maybe how we address that? Just from personal experience, I've talked to many people who
don't necessarily view homosexuality in a healthy way. I think a lot of people don't put themselves in other people's shoes very well. And I feel like that's probably the number one thing that we need to do is, what if I were them? And it's not always an easy thing to do, but I feel like it's something that we need to do to be able to relate to that. And I mean, I've heard people say, oh, why would we want them in our church? But that's not the right idea at all. It should totally be trying to include everybody and build them up, not just throw them to the wolves.
And Kristen, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't disagree with anything you said. I just think a lot of times in the church, we're scared. We don't know where the balance is between acceptance and calling things out. But I think a lot of times by wishing to not offend, we withhold a cure from the people. And so by being afraid of topics such as homosexuality, you know, a lot of sexual things that are kind of hush-hush in the church that people don't want to talk about, we withhold what we could be doing for them. And, you know, in preparation for this, I was just watching some videos, particularly on Cy Rogers. If you remember him, he spoke here last year. But, you know, his testimony, and he said that when he was trying to find restoration from being a homosexual, that he went to church and he was expecting to walk in and be shut down, but he was offered an arena where people were willing to accept him and take him under and not be afraid. I think, you know, a lot of times there's a lot of fear of, you know, if I accept this person, does that mean that people are going to think we're partners or that we're, you know, I'm this way as well? And I think a lot of it is getting over ourselves and just being willing to maybe look dirty, to, you know, maybe get some mud on our shoes and to go in and help people and not just think it's the pastor's job, not think that it's not my problem, but to realize that as the body of Christ, this is my obligation, this is my duty. I need to step out and help this person because that's what Jesus would have done, that's what we should be doing.
And you both have mentioned acceptance but taking a biblical stance on homosexuality. So I want to ask Kristen, is there a distinction between taking a religious stance against homosexuality and being homophobic?
Oh, definitely. I think homophobic would be people who you see someone and you run the other direction. And that's the opposite thing that we should be doing. We should be running toward the lost and not away from them. The thing that is, in the church, you know, there's a lot, I think there's also a lot of media that tells the church what the church is, and that says, you know, this is how the church reacts. And so there are a lot of those expectations kind of already predisposed upon the church. And I think that's unfortunate, but it's also our job to do those wrong. And we should absolutely not be homophobic. If, you know, when you walk down the sidewalk and you see a homosexual couple, I think the last thing you should be doing is going, oh, gross, you know, that's just not, I could never imagine doing that. And while you couldn't, I couldn't, but that doesn't mean that we should have that visceral reaction to people who are of same-sex attraction. But I think our response should be more one of reaching out to people, just like you would reach out to someone who is doing drugs or who is an alcoholic or anything like that. It should be the church opening their arms and accepting them in, teaching their people how to react to things like that, and then showing them Jesus and working with them through their problems instead of seeing the problems and having that be just the red line that you can't get away from.
Thank you. And Drew, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that, and also want to ask, how have you personally seen homophobia in the church?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, I think a big line that gets drawn is people will say that they don't want to be tolerant of sin and then homosexuality specifically. But I think the biggest difference is like intolerance versus homophobia is completely different to me. I really liked your definition of homophobia, of just running the other way. We should never be disgusted or repelled by other people's sin. I don't feel like that's what Jesus ever did. He saw sin and he ran to it and he tried to help people. And I think that should be more of our approach, not necessarily just like throwing it to the side as something that's just completely absurd to us or something like that. As far as what I've seen in the church, it's kind of hard to pin down specific instances, but a lot of times, I think you kind of nailed it on the head too. A lot of times I think the church gets told what they are, and I don't feel like that's healthy either, because that's not how it works. You are who you are, and caring about what other people think of you, that's not something Jesus did either. And I haven't necessarily personally seen a lot of direct homophobia, you could say, in the church, but I feel like we've all been able, it's not very hard to look up a horror story.
And Kristen, another debate with homosexuality in the church is, should those who live in a homosexual lifestyle be allowed to be a member of the church and even at some points take leadership positions? And I want to know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, that's a tough call. And I think it's something that, well, there are a lot of different opinions on it, but I do think that in leadership positions that those leaders are held to a higher standard. But then again, you get into murky waters when you say, but this person struggles with greed and he's in leadership, or she struggles with fill in the blank. We all struggle with stuff, and I think that should also be a bottom line for this, is that we're all sinners and we're all in need of grace, and so are people who struggle with same-sex attraction. If I had to give a yes or no answer to should people who are in homosexual relationships be involved in leadership in the church, I would say no. I think that leaders portray an example that other people should follow, and that are called to a higher standard, a higher calling. And I don't think that people who are actively involved in homosexual relationships should be involved in leadership in the church.
Drew, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I see is homosexuality is a very visible sin. A lot of times, you can hide it to an extent, but a lot of times it's, especially if you're in a relationship, a lot of times, there's no hiding it. Things like greed or even lust to an extent, those are hideable sins. So, how many pastors have we seen that have, fallen, you could say. So to say that we should all, we definitely shouldn't expect perfection from our leaders, but I definitely agree. We should hold them to a higher standard, especially, if we know something, we should want correction, and so should our leaders in that way. So I definitely agree.
Would you be willing to see someone in a leadership position at church if they are pushing for change in their life?
Absolutely. I think Cy Rogers is a really good example of that. I'm glad that you brought it up. But I would be more than happy to have somebody like that be a pastor. If anything, I would be more strengthened by that. Or if I had a pastor who's like, I openly struggle with greed, so here's my tithing record or something like that, I would be ecstatic if something like that happened. But I don't think that happens a lot with anybody. But yeah, I would be okay with that happening.